Up next, we have Federica MAESTRI from the University of Luxembourg, who is now going to present her project titled ALS, When Genetics Epidemiology Comes Together. She seeks to answer the following question: to what extent do mutations and socioeconomic status correlate with the onset of Lou Gehrig's disease?
Good morning. My name is Federica, and today I would like to walk you through my research about amyotrophic lateral sclerosis and its possible causations. ALS belongs to a large group of neurological conditions known as motor neuron diseases, which result in the gradual deterioration and death of motor neurons in the brain, brainstem, and spinal cord. Motor neurons are essential communication links between the brain and voluntary muscle movement. Consequently, people affected by ALS have difficulties in breathing, swallowing, chewing. They burn calories at a faster rate. But they retain their ability to perform higher mental processes, such as reasoning, understanding, remembering. And this is extremely significant because it shows that even though they lose physical control, they are completely aware of their degrading conditions. Scientists have not yet understood why ALS strikes just certain people and not others. So, when it comes to rare diseases, in Luxembourg, there are about 5,000 to 8,000 rare disease cases that have been identified. And a key event at national level was the European Conference on Rare Diseases within the framework of the European Presidency of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. To go back to ALS, age, gender, and ethnicity all represent risk factors. Men are more likely to get diagnosed with it, even though this difference disappears with age. Uniform rates can be found in Caucasian populations in respect to the other ones, and 90% of the cases are considered as sporadic, which means that the disease occurs randomly with no clear correlation to the risk factors and family history. The remaining 10% inherits it through a mutated gene. So as for now, hyperlemia, smoking, farming as an occupation, strenuous physical activity, epidemiological modifications, and exposure to environmental factors have all been identified as possible risk factors. So the first causations that I've investigated was the mutation of the TDP43 gene, which is an heterogeneous nuclear ribonucleoprotein. So this gene is involved in neural genome maintenance, in the repair of DNA double-strand breaks, and its toxicity helps regulating the levels of RNA binding proteins implicated in RNA splicing. So what happens is that the aberrant systolic sequestration of this gene leads to protein aggregation, and protein aggregation leads to genomic instability, which results in neuronal death. The second cause that I've investigated was the mutation of another gene, the superoxide dismutase. And it has been shown that it's the gene responsible for producing the mutant superoxide dismutase protein that's responsible for, that might become toxic. And this gene is not only linked to ALS, but it's also linked to other neurodegenerative diseases, such as, for example, frontotemporal dementia. And this study was conducted on mice, and it has been shown that even when the quantity of mutant gene was less than the quantity of non-mutant gene, the disease was still developed. And therefore, this kind of mice might help us understanding the pathogenic pathway of the disease. However, we have to point out, to mention the ethical part that comes with working in mice in science, and the fact that there are some studies that have shown and are showing that mice might not be such a good model for neurological diseases as we thought. But for example, zebrafish could be. The last causation that I've investigated was the epidemiological trend. So in a paper published by the US National Library, it has been shown that there will be a 69% increase in cases in the next 25 years. So the question that arises is ALS a disease of aging? And the answer, according to this paper, is yes. But according to other papers, the answer is no, because yes, there will be an increase in incidence, but this is not due to the fact that the ALS is a disease of aging, but the fact that ALS affects a vulnerable group within the population, rather than being a disease of aging. So for sure, survival rates will most likely go up due to improvements in healthcare. And another thing that we have to consider when analyzing data is the fact that there might be some discrepancies in the methodologies that have been used by the different countries to gather their data. So to conclude, there's a huge gap in literature. For example, the mutation of the two genes was only investigated in cases of sporadic ALS, which represents only 10% of all cases. And even though I found that socioeconomic factors and geographical prevalence might have a connection, not enough data is still available to understand which factor is more relevant. And genetics and environmental factors are seen to be playing a role, but ALS does not have any racial or ethnic boundaries, which points out the controversy of studying this disease. And therefore, large-scale studies are needed in order to allocate healthcare resources more efficiently. And therefore, the next step in scientific research would be the assessment of the correlation between a lineage, environment, and ALS phenotype. So, as for now, artificial intelligence, we might say that artificial intelligence might speed up the research on neurodegenerative diseases. But the direction in which AI and the analyzing of data is going is we want to eliminate biases. And by bias, we mean bias related to gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic factors, for example. But the thing is that when it comes to neurodegenerative diseases, where we have these factors whose relevance has not been fully evaluated yet, we cannot disregard this data in order to prevent biases, because arguably, they might hold the key for a cure. Thank you.
Hello, Federica. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you very much for your earlier talk. We're happy to have you around and to ask a few more questions. So what I'm curious about is to know, what was the starting point for your research on ALS? What was your motivation?
I had a family friend that was diagnosed with ALS. And therefore, I was curious about investigating more about this disease and the fact that there's no cure for it. And it's what made me start my investigation. And when I realized that there's actually a connection between the way we analyze neurological diseases and artificial intelligence, the way we analyze data sets and data, made me want to continue with my research.
Have you faced any specific difficulties during your project?
Yes, I feel like as in every neurological disorder, it's really hard to find the right papers. And also, since the literature is a bit limited, it was hard for me to find many studies and compare the studies. Some studies are controversial. Some say one thing, some others say another thing. But I think it's not only because of studying ALS, but in rare neurological conditions in general.
And the fact that there's so little literature, is that a motivation for you to also continue your research after the project? Would that be something to look into?
Yes, I feel like also, the more people that start studying about ALS, the more the scientific research will be motivated to continue with experiments and studies about it. And I feel like there's always has to be a starting point somewhere. So yeah, I definitely believe that having people who start researching more about these conditions is definitely an improvement and a step forward.
It might not be completely related to your project, but during your research, have you discovered things that you should pay attention to in terms of persons that have this kind of disease?
What do you mean?
For example, preconceptions people have, or things that people handle a certain way and that you should rather not do?
Yes, I believe that the word rare disease make it seem like something really rare, and therefore people never think about the fact that there might be a starting point of these diseases, and therefore the first symptoms are sometimes disregarded because they're not considered important. And I feel like maybe a bit more awareness about the fact that yes, these diseases are there because are rare because there's a small part of the population that's affected by them, but the fact that we shouldn't completely disregard them and maybe think, this cannot happen to me. Yeah, I feel like it's a bit a misconception about rare disease and the fact that there are not many people that are affected by it, and therefore it's not that important.
So to be more aware about it.